G'day lenses, Charles Martin here for another short talk about one of the topics that you'll be working on in this year's course. So this week we're going to talk about how to make music over the internet together. More broadly, this is a topic that I often call network music making, because the same techniques aren't just applicable for making music over the internet, but they can also be used for connecting devices which might be in the same room, or connecting devices separated in time but not space, maybe different people coming in to access a device at different time. So the time-space matrix divides collaborations supported by computer tools into 4 quadrants. Basically, on the y-axis there you've got time, which can either be the same or different. On the x-axis you've got space, which can be the same or different. And then that leaves us with 4 different options. Different time, same space. Different time, different space, same time, same space, same time, and different space. So I think you know that most of our collaborations, our normal collaborations in Laptop Ensemble have been in this area, same time, same space. I think today I'm just going to go through some examples that different music technology researchers have created for working in these other parts of the quadrant. But actually networks can help in this quadrant as well, so we'll talk about that. So first of all, let's just overview this, putting different musical contexts in. Of course, we've got our normal kind of ensemble interaction, same location at the same time, traditional ensembles. We can do collaborations across networks in different locations at the same time. I would call that kind of synchronous but remote interaction. Then there's ideas of doing collaborations at different times but in the same location, which is a bit of a strange one. That's one that it tends not to be so well explored, but it's very interesting when it is. And then finally, like different time and different location, so remote asynchronous interactions, not at the same time, not at the same place. So what about same time, different location? This one is probably the most well explored in terms of network audio. It's in some sense the easiest to set up, but it's the hardest to get right, to get it to support the kinds of experience we want it to support. So I've seen a lot of concerts that look like this, these images on the left, where there's some performers who are in real locations in a concert hall, and then maybe there's some people who are participating connected by Zoom or Skype or whatever. And that's one way of bringing a remote performer into a local performance. There's other kinds of interpretations of this. Something which has popped up over the last few years, which no one really expected, was the idea of people who are broadcasting themselves, narrowcast to many followers on platforms like Twitch or YouTube. This is Lara6683, who plays video game covers on Twitch. So she can perform remotely to many viewers who are watching her in real time, and they're chatting back to her. People also have worked out creative ways of doing performances in the same time at different location using phones. This is something which has been happening all through the 20th century. As soon as these technologies have been available, composers have used them to create interesting distributed compositions across many people in different cities connected by phone networks. There's also some quite sophisticated ideas of sending percussion signals over the internet using different kinds of sensors, like camera sensors or machine learning algorithms that predict what kind of sounds are, so that you can send a message very quickly. If you're doing live coding, that's quite a sort of narrow stream of data that has to be communicated. So live coders have often found ways to collaborate with systems such as Gibber. I know there's experiments in extempore to do sort of synchronous live coding of multiple people. And it's one way of collaborating together. So you're sending your keystrokes to each other, basically, sending text over the internet that gets interpreted on your computer. Same time, same location is something which we don't often think about it in terms of a situation where networks can help, because these are where we already have all of the tools we need to do our performance. But I've worked a lot in this field myself. I've worked on creating ensembles of iPad performers where the iPads are sending little network messages to each other to update their interfaces in real time. And it's something that a lot of laptop ensembles often do, is to create a network between them so that they can share data during their performances. And there's no particular reason why these techniques can't be sort of expanded over the internet, although you just have to take into account a few technical limitations. This is something which is starting to become more mainstream in for instance, Ableton Link, which lets you combine different pieces of software with a common sort of rhythmic click. And it's now starting to gain a bit of traction. Different time, same location. This one's a bit of a weird one, isn't it? Because we often don't think of music collaborations happening at the same place, but at different times. But there's examples of people who have created so-called locative performances where they, for instance, develop an app that allows someone to make some music when they're standing in a certain place in a city, for instance, and then if someone else comes along and is using that app at the same location, they can hear the same sound. There's an example on the right of a system called NetDerive, which by Atao Tanaka and others, which was based on this idea of walking around a city hearing different sounds that are located in different places. There's also games like Pokemon Go, of course, which take advantage of location and players collaborating maybe at different times, or in fact not collaborating but battling out at the same location at different times. And then finally, different time, different location. So this is perhaps the most common idea that we know of when we think of network collaboration with music. Perhaps you're a producer and you've got a friend who's a musician, and they send you a file of themselves recorded over Dropbox or email, and then you can insert that into your production system and collaborate with them across networks that way. So that's something which is now really common in all kinds of work, but doing it with music is no exception, and I expect that that's something that you will have considered for your groups as well. I've actually done some work in this area creating an app called MicroJam, which is sort of demonstrated in this lower right-hand corner, where the users of this app could create a little musical performance on their phone just using the touch screen. Then that would be sort of uploaded into the system in this kind of Instagram interface. Other people can download it and reply to it, which they would then keep adding extra layers on top. So this idea of layering up a musical performance by sending files around is often the dynamic of working in this different time, different location way. Now that we've gone through a couple of different modes of working together with music, I'll talk about maybe the chief limitation of doing music over networks, and that's latency. So this is latency and why network music is doomed. Whenever you send a message from one place to another, it takes time. And unfortunately, when we're sending messages across networks, generally the latency time is long enough to mess up a musical performance if it's based on, for example, matching up rhythms very accurately. So latency is always a factor in collaborations. And it can really mess you up, particularly if you're trying to collaborate across very long distances. If you're collaborating across continents, there is quite a long latency. Even the lowest expected latency, or the time of light in a vacuum between two locations across the surface of the Earth, is non-zero. For instance, between New York to Sydney, light in a vacuum will take 50 milliseconds. If the light is in a fiber optic cable, it's a little bit slower, it takes 80 milliseconds. So a round trip of you sending a sound, going to New York and coming back is going to take 160 milliseconds. Of course, if we're just collaborating around Canberra or sending messages from Canberra to Sydney, Canberra to Melbourne, it's going to be much shorter. And you can actually have very near real-time performances if you've got very well-tuned internet connections and very well-calibrated equipment. But in general, we don't. I suppose what we have to do is live with latency. So one of the ways of living with latency is just to accept it. We can do forms of music that don't require tight synchronizations. So it doesn't matter if you're hearing a note which is 160 milliseconds behind when the person last played it. And that's completely possible, and in particular it's possible in a laptop ensemble where we don't particularly have expectations that we ought to be able to play in time. If you're trying to play music in a really tight jazz band, for instance, and you need to play fast and for all of the notes to be exactly in sync, that's going to be a limitation. But in laptop ensemble, we don't need to do that. Another way around this issue is to use different types of predictions. So if you know that a note is going to be played maybe a few milliseconds before it is, you might be able to send a message across the network early, and then on the other end, it could create a synthesized sound instead to represent that note. This is something which can work really well with percussion sounds, because if you're playing an acoustic instrument with a stick, it takes an amount of time for the stick to come down towards the instrument. And as that stick is coming down, the closer it gets, the more sure you are of exactly when it's going to hit. So there's a system called Mallow, where researchers used cameras and some computer vision techniques to kind of predict when these signals would reach the other end. Another approach to this is to kind of do some tests on your network and figure out exactly what your latency is going to be, and then perhaps incorporate that into a piece of music. So I know there's been performances of the Stanford Laptop Orchestra between Stanford and Beijing, where they had measured the latency time and calibrated their performance of a piece of music called in C, where it doesn't exactly matter if you play the notes at the same time. If they're out by 1/8 note, it actually works in the piece of music. So they calibrated in C and played it exactly in the right tempo so that given this latency time, it would sound good at both ends, which was a pretty cool idea. So what are we going to do in Laptop Ensemble? What kind of tools can we use? I'm going to talk about a few tools for synchronous audio performances. The first one is a system called Jack Trep, which is a software that supports high quality network audio between 2 points. So if you want to collaborate with one person over the internet, then this would help you to do that. Jack Trep gives you, you'd be using this Linux audio system called Jack, which also runs on other platforms, thankfully. And then Jack Trep sort of shows up as another output, so you can send something to your Jack Trep connection. So this is kind of like an audio cable going through the internet to your other player, right? You've got an audio cable in your computer, you plug that in, and they've got an audio cable at their end that they can plug in. So you can hear them and they can hear you. And then what about signals, musical signals that aren't MIDI? Well, of course we aren't audio. We have MIDI, which is sort of sequences of data getting sent between computers that might control notes or different parameters. There's already a great system for sending MIDI over the internet. It's sometimes called Apple MIDI or RTP MIDI. The good news here is that that's built into macOS. The bad news is I know I'm in the minority of people in the group using macOS for their laptop ensemble performances. The second good news is that you can get a client for Windows and Linux and try that out as well. So this is similar to the Jack Trep idea, that you've got a big long MIDI cable and I can plug it in on my computer and plug it in on someone's computer across the internet as well and send signals between two players. But I guess one thing which would be really nice to have, and we don't quite have, would be some sort of mixer across the internet. So what I want is for everyone in the laptop ensemble to be plugging their laptop into a big mixer, and then the sound of everyone mixed together gets sent back to everyone. And that's not really supported by Jack Trep or RTP MIDI. These things are more designed for point-to-point connections. But there are other systems that you can use that give you something like this experience. And the one that I've been playing with is called Mumble. So this is an open source voice chat system designed for groups of gamers playing together online, and they'd like to have some way of sending their voice to everybody on their team. But it works just well enough for audio. It probably has limitations in terms of quality, but we can deal with those when we get to them. But the way that I've figured out to get Mumble working between my computers is to use a audio driver called Black Hole on my MacBook. So I've got Black Hole set up as an audio driver that kind of allows me to send audio to different pieces of software. So I can set the output of PD to be Black Hole, that's sending audio into Black Hole. And then the input for Mumble is Black Hole as well. So whenever I send audio from PD, it goes through Black Hole and then goes into Mumble. And I might record a little demo of setting this up and what it sounds like in a little bit, but for the moment you can just see that in my PD window, I've got patched up a little synthesizer, and that's going to my DAC, that's going to Black Hole and then to Mumble. And then I might have a microphone or something hooked into PD as well, so I can speak across the same connection. So this means that my audio is sent to the Mumble server, and then everybody else on the Mumble server can hear me, and they can hear everybody else performing at the same time, which is kind of what we want. The only problem with this is that then I can't hear myself because the output from my PD is going to Black Hole, not going to my speakers. But in Mumble, you can select this loopback option that gives you a kind of local, turns around your audio locally and plays it back out your speakers. So you can use that just to hear what your sounds are as you're performing. So it might be fun to do a little Mumble test with people sometime. I'll do a screencast about it later, but for now, thanks for listening.